So as well as the narrowband, the narrowband transponder that we've heard about from David, of course there's the wideband digital transponder, not actually defined as only for a digital ATV, but currently I think that's mainly what it's being used for. And we're lucky to have Noel, one of the experts from the BATC, to tell us all about the wideband transponder. Noel?
Okay, thank you Graham, and thank you David, who has shortened my presentation by about 10 slides because he's actually done all of the introduction to the actual satellite. Just to remind you of the one slide, I mean that's 1/3 of the Earth. It's pretty awesome, and the great thing is when you think of the DX, you know, some rare DX down in perhaps Africa, actually they're closer to the satellite than we are, so it's really opened things up. David's already introduced the wideband transponder. It's 8 megahertz wide, a bent pipe, basically what we put in comes out. No AGC on the wideband transponder. And BATC was contacted a couple of years ago by AMSAT-DL because they were starting to get towards the planning stage of how was this 8 megahertz going to be used, and they really didn't understand quite where ATV was at that time. And one of the problems is ATV has got so many potential modes and usages by the community. Because we've adopted DVB-S for digital ATV, we have got totally flexible bandwidth. And that becomes more difficult to try and put together a band plan. So the band plan for the narrowband segment is fairly simple. But when you try and put together a band plan that accommodates all of the DATV modes, you have to think about, well, it's going to be the wideband modes at 2 megasymbols. When I say megasymbols, interpret into megahertz for this afternoon. Some people want to run 1 megasymbol, others want to go down and run really narrow 125 megasymbols. So our band plan looks a lot more complicated than the narrowband segment. I've basically, in my own mind, transferred that into, say, we've got a couple of channels which you can run 2 megahertz in, we've got a couple of channels where we can run 1 megahertz. The really interesting area for me is down here where we've got 330 kilosymbols, so those channels are about 0.5 meg wide, and then some of the really smaller stuff is in the final megahertz. And so we've segmented the transponder into a number of areas, and it seems to work pretty well. If you look at, and it's possible that you can look at it, you will see there's always one signal on because there is a wideband beacon which is uplinked from Doha, and that's a TV channel with a rolling promotional video which we all use for testing our receive system on, and that sits on one of the yellow channels. So how do you receive it? Well, at first you think it's easy because, as David illustrated, you can take one of these LMBs and you can use your Sky Dish, and you can then just put that into a satellite receiver, can't you? Well, not quite. There's 2 reasons why not quite. The LMBs are designed for the TV channels, which are higher in frequency than our TV channels, which means that the IF output from them comes down, as David has already said, to around 740 megahertz. And your standard consumer receivers are 950 megahertz up to 2150. We are on horizontal, which means you need to put 18 volts up the cable. And David has already mentioned about PLL, LMBs, and the older type of DROs. For digital TV, using the PLL is a must, but we would actually caution against going on and doing the modifications to the external locks, as he mentioned for narrowband, to give it the stability, because what we found is that most of the locking modifications tend to increase the phase noise. And one of the things that you'll find with digital TV is it's very critical on phase noise, but not on frequency accuracy. So for digital TV, we suggest you don't do the phase mod or do the locking modifications. So a standard LNB puts it down at 741 megahertz, which means you can't use a standard set-top box as it stands. So what do you do? Well, you can modify the LNB such that the local oscillator now produces an IF output which is in the range of the set-top box. You can up-convert the signal to L-band, and David showed the AMSAT-DL box which will take the 741 and convert it up to L-band. Or you can use a different USB tuner. Both of those solutions would enable you to use a set-top box to receive the signals on the wideband satellite. But the problem is that majority of signals on the DATV transponder are going to be very narrow bandwidth. And what you will find is that your standard set-top box that you buy off eBay or Amazon or got the cupboard, and it used to be Maplin, will only receive signals which are within the DVB specification of 1 megasymbol and above. So the majority of the TV signals that you will find on the satellite are below 1 megasymbol wide. And so even though you've done the modifications to get the signal into the frequency range covered by the satellite receiver, it still won't receive them. You will be able to receive the 2 megasymbol beacon, the 2 megahertz beacon. And I know several people have got one of those running in their shack and just displaying the receiver, the beacon on a separate screen. But ideally, you need to look at doing a different receiver. And that's where this thing called a mini tuner comes in. And essentially, it is a piece of hardware which consists of a mini tuner, consists of a satellite tuner and a USB interface. BATC sells the components. And what that does is it uses a tuner which is capable of tuning down to 741 megahertz. So you can put a standard phase lock loop LNB straight into this hardware, and using the software which has been developed by F6DZP, you will be able to receive all of the signal combinations that you can find on the satellite. So this really is the recommended solution to be able to receive the Es'hail-2 satellites. So what's on the satellites? Well,
at the moment now.
we are. Yeah. There we go then. I am. So this is, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is the spectrum monitor display, which is available online from Goonhilly. And what it shows is the different channels that I've talked about. And this signal is always there, apart from 2 weeks ago when the transmitter failed. But this signal here is uplinked from Doha, and it's a 2 megasymbol HD signal, which is running a loop of talking about the satellite. There's an interview with A71AU, the father of the project, and that's a very useful signal because it enables us to calibrate our receivers. And a lot of us, when we go into the shack, the first thing we do is do a quick check to see if that's still there. And if it is, you know your receive system's working. But as you can see here, there are other signals. These two signals, that's roughly 1 megahertz wide. So these two are 1 megahertz wide, but this one you'll see is a lot narrower. So that's actually a 250 kilohertz symbol. We've had stations trying right down to 32 kilosymbols, which is about 50 kilohertz wide, and they've actually transmitted good decodable video. So these two signals, these four signals rather, different signals. That one you would be able to receive on a satellite receiver, these two you wouldn't. So with all of these combinations, when we were approached by AMSAT-DL, we thought this is going to be difficult. Without some form of coordination of being able to see what's on, even though those who have got the receivers and know about this stuff would have difficulty knowing what's on the satellite at any one time, because you can't tell by looking at a signal exactly what it is and how to decode it. And so BATC took on board to build a ground station receiver which gives a web-based spectrum monitor, which you've just seen, and an analysis tool which gives an indication of how wide the signal is. It also includes a chat window, so people can say what's going on. So I don't know what's on there at the moment, but they're probably talking about us, because this is a unique screenshot. This was taken 2 weeks ago when the beacon wasn't actually on. But what you've got in the side here is people saying, I'm transmitting on 49775 and in 250 kilosymbols, probably saying DVBS. So by reading the chat window and looking at the signals on the side, you can actually then set your receiver correctly. Mr. Talbot.
There's a narrow spike where the wideband was genuine or spot. Would be spike if someone was playing.
When the wideband beacon went off, all sorts of weird things happened. First of all, people went up in that space. We wonder if that was actually the beacon transmitter having gone a little spurious. We're not sure, but yes. But the point being, without this monitor, we that's made the whole thing usable. Now that's available online. Anybody with a web browser can go to it. You can join in the chat, you can see what's going on. It sits alongside at Goonhilly, alongside the web SDR for the narrowband segment, which hopefully most of you have found. And it in fact uses a common dish and LMB, and is locked using a Leo Bodner system. And both of them share the same 1.2 metre dish. So that's down at Goonhilly Earth Station, primarily because of the excellent web connectivity, because the first weekend we saw over 600 users between the two sites. So we've got 250 megabits upstream, so we can handle the traffic. So how do you receive it? It's slightly more difficult to receive and transmit TV than it is the narrowband. When you're receiving, we would suggest aim for a 1 metre dish. And David didn't mention about the fun of aligning the dish. We've been putting the message out. There was an article in Ragcom back in November about how to align your dish, because it's very convenient that actually there are some other commercial TV services on the same transponder or same slot, and they're much louder than the Es'hail signals. So you can in fact even today still use the BADR4 TV services, and once you've found those, you should be able to receive the wideband beacon on the Es'hail. One of the other things you can of course do is look for the narrowband beacons, because they will come in before the wideband signals do. But I think, you know, it's about patience. You just got to work out where the angles are. You've got to make sure your pole's vertical. You just got to take it step by step, make sure your frequency's right, your offsets are right, and you will get there. I mentioned that the beacon is handy because people use it to calibrate the receivers. What it also enables us to do is say, for a given dish size, we believe you should receive, in digital TV terms, that's our signal to noise or modulation error rate. You should receive the beacon, the wideband beacon, at a given MER. And that's very useful for people who are just getting started. They'll come up and say, how loud should it be? And we can say, it's that strength. And there's a bit of a competition developing. You know, somebody with a 1.2 metre dish actually said he'd received it with 9 dB the other day, and we all went, better get out in the garden. So it's relatively easy to receive. Slightly bigger dish. We're saying aim for a 1 metre probably, but you can receive the TV services on 80 centimetres. I've seen the beacon on an 80 centimetre dish, so it will work. And of course, don't forget, all of this technology is sky dish size. You know, so the larger sky dish sizes will do this. The price on eBay of larger dishes seems to have gone through the roof. Actually receiving the signals, as I said, 80% of the signals on Oscar 100 are below the 1 megahertz or 1 megasymbols. Most are in this region of 125 to 500 kilosymbols. And to receive the narrower band ones, you really need to be on frequency. And so how to do that is to listen to the narrowband beacon on your SDR and check what your offset is. You really wouldn't have to do this for narrowband, but for what we're saying for the narrow TV signals, this offset frequency really needs to be spot on so that you're within 50 kilohertz, let's say, of the signal. But you wouldn't have to do that with the beacon when you first start. So let's have a look in practice. This was a screenshot of the web monitor after the beacon had been switched back on. And it just so happened quite nicely that our friend in Belgium had appeared with his 2 megasymbol. So this one is an amateur signal. And this one down here is another nice little amateur signal. And I took some recordings. So the first one is Colin, who's in the audience. Now this is 250 kilosymbols, so about 300 kilohertz. And if I click on there, you should move.
G4EML. A bit of trouble locking my signal then, but I think it's coming through okay now. So that's with about between 25 and 30 watts to a 1 meter dish, using the ports down transmitter with a Pi cam. Can't move the camera around at the moment, but I'm hoping to get that sorted soon. But that appears to be working fairly well. I'm getting only about 1 dB MER on the receive, but I'm actually hearing myself come back quite well. Bit of a delay, as you can probably hear. It's a bit off-putting, but it's working, so good.
Now, if you remember, there was another signal on the satellite. And this is our friend in Belgium.
It's running stable. I connected the dashboard. Maybe I will show it later on. I made a small dashboard of it, and the data is being put into a storage on the internet, and of that you can have graphics or GOG meters from Google, and I can see in an instance if the device is operating well.
At 2 megasymbols, that was full HD resolution, so you know, I mean, that looked really, really good. And all I'm really trying to demonstrate is the difference between the two signals. One is that's in 300 kilohertz, the other one is just over 2 megahertz wide. So there's a variety of signals up there, which you know, it gives people the opportunity to experiment with bandwidths and video coding and all sorts of things. So there are a couple of the signals off there. Let's see if we can get this to now do what we want it to do. Yeah. So that's just a still shot of him. So, okay. So transmit. How do we actually transmit? Well, David's already covered the frequencies. We're on 240.1.5 up to 240.9.5. Don't worry about the neighbour's Wi-Fi, is all I would say. I haven't actually heard anybody who complained, although I did have somebody tell me the other day that he was planning, because the uplinks tend to be remote, he was planning to use a Wi-Fi switch to turn his transmitter on and off. Well, I bet he could probably turn it on. And that's a true story. The great thing is duplex is easy because you're on different frequencies, so duplex is great. I've got some numbers in a minute, but you're talking about 30 watts into a 1.2 meter dish. That's my particular setup. But you'll notice one thing, the thing that us microwavers know, the piece of wire between the antenna and the PA has got to be kept really short. And we use a modulation form which is DVB-S2, because what we found is that every dB really does matter, and by using the DVB-S2 modulation form rather than the original standard DVB-S, we're gaining an extra 2 dB purely in modulation coding terms for a given bandwidth. We gain 2 dB, and when we were doing the original planning, AMSAT-DL were insisting it was going to be DVB-S2. We were quite sceptical, but the first few days really proved that the stations who ran DVB-S2 rather than DVB-S were the ones which were being more successful, because every dB really does count. So for wideband, our typical system will look something like a PC or the BATC ports down transmitter, basically to do the encoding when passing the transport stream over USB, probably into something like a Lime SDR or Pluto. And as we heard earlier, about 0 dBm or 1 milliwatt out. And so that can then be fed either into a transverter and go up to 2.3 gigahertz, or because these devices these days will produce 2.3 gigahertz directly, that could go directly into the amplifier. Now, a lot of us are finding that the satellite is basically in the wrong piece of the sky, and so we're having to put our dishes some distance away from where our shacks are. And you saw it out in the foyer, great big long lead, dish out in the road to get in the to see the sky between the tower and the building. At home, I've got about 40 meters of cable between the shack and the dish, because it has to go all the way around the fence, right round to the back garden. And so most of us are now finding that we're having to use some form of driver amplifier at 2.4 gigs, and then, note the filter, and then the power amplifier with a very short lead to the dish. And That's fairly typical of what people are doing. Now, because the power requirements are higher for DATV, this is tending to be the most difficult element in the whole picture. And that slide just basically says what I've already said. You can up convert using your narrowband 13.7 transverter, but you would have to retune it because we're 80 megahertz wide away from the narrowband segment, or use one of the other up converters that are on the market, and generate at 2.4 using the SDR applications. So how much power do we really need? So these are, the numbers are more complicated for DATV because as the bandwidth changes, the amount of power you require is less or more. So what we've tried to do to give people an idea of how much power is to say, if you want to be at the same level as the beacon, if you remember in those spectrum monitors, if you want to try and deliver the same MER or signal to noise as the beacon does, if you're running 250 kilosymbols, i.e. 250 kilohertz wide, with a 1.2 meter dish, you will probably need about 30 watts. If you reduce your dish size, you will require more power. If you increase your dish size, obviously, you will require less. However, you can also reduce your bandwidth. So these numbers were for 250 kilohertz, but if you drop down to 125 kilosymbols, and you can get some pretty reasonable pictures through even at 125, you've got a factor of a half. You only need 50% of the power that you would need for 250 kilosymbols. If you're prepared to have a little less signal to noise ratio but still be decoded, by a little less signal to noise ratio than the beacon but still be decoded, so rather than the numbers we've used here, which was for 8 dB MER, but you drop the 5 dB MER, you can reduce your relative power again. So the numbers we're coming out here are to do 125 kilosymbols at 5 dB MER. You could probably run 7.5 watts into a 1.2 meter dish. And don't forget, the other challenge for us, we can't run 30 watts out of a 30 watt PA because the linearity of these devices when you're running wideband signals through, the general rule of thumb is back off by 6 dB. And so this is a pretty crucial table. If you try and run more than that, the shoulders or the spectral regrowth just climbs. And it's a real problem on all bands, but on 2.3 it becomes more of a challenge. So they're the typical numbers. So most of us are running in the order, and I think, Colin, you said you were...
25 to 1 meter.
Yeah.
But that's just about receivable.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So what are the PA options? As I say, it's probably the hardest. You can buy new, if you can afford it. You can buy ex-commercial UMTS, but most of these you need to be careful because most are designed for 2.1 gigs, and some of them will run nicely at 2.3 gigs, but by the time you get to 2.4, they've fallen off the face of the earth. The best option we're finding at the moment is the Spectran units from Pyro Joe. And he did have a lot left. I don't know if he's got many left now because we've been saying this, and I suspect he's probably running short. But that bottom point is, of course, remember, they must be backed off. For us, there's probably only one show in town, and that's the one that somebody's stolen from.
No, it's back with you.
So this This feed, very good. If you didn't get it, the LNB goes on the back end and looks through the 22mm water pipe as a waveguide, and the patch on the front, which is the right-hand circular 2.4 gig patch, all at Mike's left-hand circular, because it's going into the dish to come out right-hand. And all that Mike has done is taken, not all, there's more to it than that, but basically it's the standard patch as you know it, but with the 22mm hole drilled through the middle. And it really is, it's become the go-to standard for particularly for the TV transmit.
For microwavers, they're used to using the term plumbing, but this is the first time I've seen microwaves with a compression coupler.
And I mean, it seems to be really successful. I mean, because of the beacon there, you can do before and after measurements, and the majority of us are finding that it's within half to 1 dB loss, if that. It's a pretty easy solution. Seems to work well. I don't know how many people run this system. Colin, yeah, Mark. No. There's variations on that. So you could just use sticky tape around there, I suppose. So dish feed, there really is no other answer at the moment for true dual band, because the reason why receive is important to us is Dave didn't really major on it, but for narrowband you can get away with listening to the Goon-Hilly Web SDR, and that does full decode and demodulation. And so my first QSOs, and I think a lot of people's first QSOs on the satellite, were done using direct transmit, but then listening to the Goon-Hilly Web SDR to get your receive signal. On TV, and this is a question we're often asked, you've done the wideband spectrum monitor, why haven't you done a decode, and why don't you stream the video? And the answer to that is every single signal is different. Different symbol rate, different FEC, different frequency. And so what channel do we receive to actually stream? And there is no one solution. And so really, to be able to receive these signals, you've really got to build your own receive system. You will find that occasionally on the wideband chat, people will say, I'm streaming this particular signal on my own channel. But apart from that, there is no other way of receiving it if you haven't got your own receive system. But, receive is easy. Transmit capability is more of a challenge, but not impossible. A number of us around the room have done it. CQTV, which was out this week, but was out last week actually. I gave this presentation 2 weeks ago. Had a load more details on all of this, which we've covered. But and the way to get started really is to get on the wideband chat, see what's going on, and then get a receiver working. And then I'm afraid it's a slippery slope from there. And as Graham says, it's the ultimate time waster. I mean, I've wasted so much time on this project. It's just unbelievable. So there we go. That's all I got to say.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, you've heard from David on the narrowband and Noel on the wideband. Questions for either? If David's still in the room, you may have.
Well, we'll try and ask them.
Yeah. Questions for Noel, and we'll.
I'll get you on the narrowband. There is some response. It will work below the lower beacon and above the upper beacon. How naughty is that?
Turn the stream. I'll let you answer that from an AMSAT perspective, Graham.
Doing that?
What was the last question?
How naughty is it?
How naughty?
It will work above and below.
It will work above and below. We are requested not to. You can actually go below the 2.4 gig frequency, which is the cutoff of the amateur satellite service spectrum, so that would really, really be naughty. Please control your transmissions to, as it says, within the beacons. And then they know what's going on. There are technical reasons why that is the preferred method of operation.
Nobody will answer you if you've got that there.
An arm up over the side, I can't see
It's
the
okay.
Oh.
Is the narrowband transponder a completely separate entity from the wideband transponder?
Yes.
And they've got separate PAs as well?
Yes.
Right? Separate
Yes.
TWTs?
Yes.
Yeah, separate
It's
TWTs.
the same receiver though, isn't it?
It's separate. It's the same receiver
Split
and
it
same receive horn.
Yeah.
Right, and they are redundant, so there is a redundant TWT for each of the two parts, is that?
I don't.
We're not 100% sure, are we? But,
Or you sacrifice the wideband one for the narrowband one?
no, the other way round, I think you'll find.
There is a risk that if they have, over the next 15 years of its design life or whatever, if they have TWT failure, these are regarded as the in-orbit spares. So, Es'hail-2 have said, we reserve the right to reallocate them.
Might find they've been used more though.
Maybe. Two questions front row.
Right, Terry, G3VFC. You've measured on narrowband and TV, but it is wideband and it's 250k or thereabouts wide on the narrowband receiver. From an emergency comms point of view, I'm interested in putting up something that looks a bit like internet IP protocol, such that you can sit at your emergency site and present the user with what apparently is internet. Is there anything to stop experimentation along those lines?
Does that user have a call sign?
But I'm asking technically and regulatory as far as AMSAT and...
In terms of technically, there's nothing to stop you doing it. I certainly wouldn't recommend anybody goes and blasts a digital signal that's 350 kilohertz wide across the narrowband transponder, unless you can do it at such a signal level that it's next to invisible. If you wish to do those experiments in the wideband transponder, please do so, but please announce yourself on the chat so that everybody else knows what's going on, because if the signal is above the noise floor, it will be seen and people will go, what's that? For instance, there have been already experiments using DVB-T, the other DVB broadcast standard, which looks different, and if you look at it you can see all the signals, and there was a lot of discussion as to what that is. So in terms of openness, I don't think there would be any problem with that at all.
You
It's
may find a
designed
problem
for-
with latency for IP packets. We've done this from MMRT point of view, so it's a problem.
But from a regulatory point of view, no, so long as the transmission is licensed and so long as it's done in an open way that everybody knows what's going on. But please don't use the whole 8 meg.
Yeah. Thank you.
So yeah.
The new dual feed, what sort of precautions do you recommend for sort of weatherproofing? Because so many examples I've seen have shown it sort of in the wall space.
Use it indoors through the...
The trouble is, my dish is like 20 foot above me. I don't have it on a ground.
That's
mount.
exactly the inside diameter of a Waitrose flapjack container. You know those pots you buy of
Must be a
£1.50.
Waitrose.
Well, a Tesco's one would have 3 dB more probably. That was cheap guy, wasn't it?
Sorry, there was another question.
No, we're all just using our imagination.
Plastic bag.
Plastic bag most of us use.
Plastic bag to keep the water out and the hole in the bottom to let. Any other questions?
Heather?
Oh, sorry.
It's probably obvious to everyone that you need a bias T in there if you're going to use an SDR for driving the octagon. You'll blow it up if you don't.
Yeah, that's a good point. Bias Ts are again readily available on the internet, or you can build them. And JW's done the designs for one. And Noel made a comment that for the wideband transponder you need 18 volts. to use the horizontal probe on the LMB.
Or you go to the LMB.
As John has said, or you turn the LMB through 90 degrees and you achieve the same thing. But I find it quite difficult to get my Es'hail to keep going out until the...
But what we have found is the narrowband transponder is so wide that you can actually rotate it through 90 degrees.
No, you mean so strong?
That's what I meant. So strong. You can rotate it through 90 degrees so it favours the wideband transponder and you can still use it on the narrowband transponder. So,
yeah, this polarisation on the LMB, the null is very deep. So on the skew, if you're trying to adjust it for maximum signal, it's really quite hard to find the maximum. But if you look at the other transponder, you'll find that the null is within 2 or 3 degrees. It's really, really, really sharp.
That's a good tip.
And actually, if you just knock it back by 5 degrees, you'll not lose much of the one you want, and then suddenly the narrowband one will come up by 10 dB, and that's quite usable as well.
Yeah.
You can null it out almost, but yeah. Any other questions?
Remco, PA3FYM, has been watching with some interest. He recommends a little Greek yogurt tin as being tin available on email.
Yeah, I think that's the translation.
Good. Well, thank you for everybody for listening. Thank you for everybody who's watching on the stream. I was just checking on the Goon Hilly monitor. There's about 170 people logged on to the narrowband stream and 155 logged on to the wideband chat. So that shows the sort of level of activity. As you can tell, a lot of us are having a lot of fun. Come and join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.